What happens when a woman decides midlife to break free of the unlived life she's been leading? Dana Spiotta will be here to discuss her latest novel, Wayward. How do the environmental threats and economic imperatives of logging affect the lives of those who make their living from cutting down trees? Ash Davidson will join us to talk about her debut novel, Damnation Spring. Alexandra Alter will be here with the latest in publishing news. Plus, my colleagues and I will talk about what we're reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's August 13th. I'm Pamela Paul. Dana Spiotta joins us now from the Catskills. She is the author of many novels, including Innocence and Others, Lightning Field, and Stone Arabia. And her latest book is called Wayward. Dana, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Pamela.
So this book begins with a house. Why? What is this house, and what role does it play in the novel?
Well, it's a falling down arts and crafts house that's in the city of Syracuse. The main character, Sam, has a habit of going to these kind of open houses with no intention to buy. And she finds this wreck of a house. And in Syracuse, you can actually buy houses for $40,000, $30,000 that are completely falling apart. And she just impulsively signs a contract for this house. And it's only when she's driving home that she realizes she's going to leave her husband and upend her entire life. And I think one of the questions that drives the novel in the beginning is, why does she do this really reckless thing with her life? But I think she falls in love with the house. And part of me was thinking of writing a midlife person blowing up their life, but I didn't want it to be because they fell in love with a younger lover, which seems kind of cliche. I thought,
yeah, we're done with that.
Yeah, we're done with that. No, this house, and I think that the question is, why does the house speak to her? And I guess it wasn't when I was writing it, I didn't think about it as much, but after I thought, okay, the house is hiding in plain sight. You could ignore it, or you could look closely and see the beauty there. And I think she thinks it speaks to her, and she's the only one that can still see that it's beautiful. And so maybe that has something to do about the state that she's in, or that her life is in too, that she needs to kind of look at her life in a different way so she can see what's still beautiful and what still needs work, maybe.
This impulse, this going to see houses with no intention to buy, I think is something that befalls many people. And I'm sure there's a psychological explanation for it. But how do you see that? What does that mean about her?
I have a strong sense that we're shaped by the places we live. And architecture is a huge part of that and a big part of the book. And so I think that she thinks if she were in this house, she'd be a different sort of person. And the impulse is to change herself. She feels she's insufficient for what's to come. There are these big issues she's facing. Her daughter's going to be going off to college soon. Her mother is dying. And she doesn't feel that she's ready for the harder terms of the second half of her life. And menopause is kind of reminding her the clock is ticking in this big way. Not to have babies, that ship has sailed, but that she needs to find a way to be in the world where she can accept what's to come. And I think she feels she needs to change, and somehow a new place is going to help her do that, face who she is, or see herself with more clarity, maybe.
You brought up menopause. I've heard this novel described as it's a menopause novel, which again, I didn't know really was necessarily a thing. You do have Eileen Fisher linen pants in there, which is a little sign. But what do you think of that description?
I mean, let's put it this way. If men went through menopause, there'd be many menopause novels. So,
right. So this is the midlife crisis novel, female version.
Maybe so, because I think the thing about it, not everybody gets symptoms, you know. I had this sleeplessness that I've given to the character of Sam. She's very different from me, but we have that in common, that insomnia. And no one warned me. I knew about hot flashes, but no one warned me about the sleeplessness, that sleep would become so difficult. And it's very humbling when your body is veering out of control. And it kind of reminds you of adolescence in reverse, right? Where your body is changing very fast. And I think that is different. Everyone, as they age, there's a kind of dwindling of hormones. But in menopause, it's really dramatic and it affects your state of mind. And it doesn't necessarily distort who you are. Maybe it reveals who you are. So I think it's an interesting state when you sort of are relocated in your body and you can't really deny that you inhabit this body that is changing and going in one direction, really. And so she tries to go to the gym and stay strong and all that stuff, but she realizes it's somewhat futile. That futility is interesting to me too.
Because then she tries to take action in other ways.
Yes, yes. One of the things about this character is that she really does want to lead a good life, an honest life, and she doesn't know how to do that, and she's trying harder, I guess. She's had a very comfortable, kind of privileged existence, but she also feels pretty divorced from reality, partially because of the election of Donald Trump. And this novel takes place in 2017, so it's particularly located in that time. She sort of realizes that the country is in shambles. The problems have been there all along, but she just hasn't done enough about it, really. So she feels a little complicit in the status quo in a way that she doesn't like.
I'm going to put off talking about the 2017-ness of this book for just a moment and go back to that idea of like an honest life or a good life. And those are quotes from her. She also refers to her life as an unlived life. What does she mean by that?
I think she has some questions about whether she's done enough with what she's been given. I think particularly with her 16, almost 17-year-old daughter, she's sort of shocked at how much misogyny is still in the culture and how little it has seemed to really change. There were these huge gains made with second wave feminism, and she grew up with all of that. And now, this kind of misogyny that happened in the 2016 election that seemed so blatant, she realized that a lot of that was in her, that she had been colonized by it. And I think Me Too kind of brought that out to a lot of women of my generation, which is like how much we put up with for so long. And what has that done for our daughters? And so, or for just younger women, if you don't have any daughters, did we do enough, right? So in some ways, that's what I think she's referring to. And the inequities and the environment and all the state of the world feels so terrible. And she has sort of blithely been going along, not really taking enough responsibility.
Let's talk a little bit about Samantha Raymond and who she is. She's not you, even though she has your insomnia. Tell us a little bit about our heroine.
She is what we used to call a housewife, a stay-at-home mom. And she has one daughter. She's married to a lawyer. It's not an unhappy marriage. I wanted to avoid a lot of cliches with her. I didn't want it to be an unhappy marriage. And that was, the problem. And I didn't want him to leave her for a younger woman. And I didn't want her to be worried about her look. She never thinks about wrinkles or her looks very much in the book. And she doesn't even look in the mirror anymore. She's not concerned about that. So she's not a superficial person. She's had a lot of privilege and comfort. And she works part-time because she doesn't need to work full-time in this historical house for this compromised 19th century feminist. She loves architecture, and architecture speaks to her. And so she constantly is noticing these abandoned old buildings around Syracuse, of which there are many beautiful old buildings that are unused, like the old Carnegie Library. They're all real buildings in the book. And she talks about them, and she's kind of a self-taught in a lot of ways. She didn't go to graduate school or anything like that. So she just kind of looks at these buildings and observes them and walks around them and touches them sometimes. And it makes her feel more connected. And she's trying to feel more connected to the community she lives in, which is a community, Syracuse specifically, that has a lot of segregation and poverty and economic devastation, as well as incredible beauty.
Architecture is a focus of the book you mentioned earlier, and your novels often kind of center on the arts, music and Stone Arabia and film and Innocence and Others. Do you make these choices deliberately at the outset, or is that just how your novels naturally work out?
I don't make it deliberately. It all comes out of character for me and character voice. And I think it's interesting when a voice has something to fasten on. I'm interested in when people are sort of deranged by love of something, whether it's film or music or architecture. It tells you something about the character, and when they see something external to them that speaks to them. And I'm interested in consciousness. So I'm interested in how the mind plays into something. And maybe it's just perversity. Like, can you get in prose these other art forms? Just like I like writing about the internet in my novels, I like the challenge of doing it all with prose and with sentences, and structure.
Well, since we're talking about the prose, why don't you pause for a moment and read a little bit from Wayward, just kind of situate where you're reading from in the novel.
I'll just read from the beginning. 2017, Sam. One way to understand what had happened to her, what she had made happen, what she had insisted upon, it began with the house. It was the particular house, but it was also where the house was and what she discovered she wanted to be. It was a rundown, abandoned arts and crafts cottage in a neglected, once vibrant neighborhood in the city of Syracuse. The house sat high on a tiny lot on Highland Street, which ran atop a hill that bordered a long expanse of grass and trees. It looked like a small, sloping park, but it was actually a cemetery, the old graves scattered across the rise. Unless you were squeamish about graves, Sam wasn't. The sloping green hill was quite pretty. Highland itself offered a wide view of downtown. You could see the steeples of churches, and you could see how the small city was in a valley surrounded by hills. You could even see the kidney shape of Onondaga Lake, although it was often partly obscured by low-hanging clouds. If you turned your head to the left, or if you looked out the side windows of the house, you could see Syracuse University up on another hill. You could locate it by the quilted low white bubble of the Carrier Dome, named for the nearly absent Carrier Corporation. All that remained were a handful of jobs, the Dome, and Carrier Circle, a treacherous traffic roundabout that Sam hated. Soon after you spotted the Dome, you would notice the various spired and turreted campus buildings. The decision to leave her husband, the act of leaving really, began the moment she made an offer on the house.
There are a couple of interesting choices in this opening section of the book. I mean, first of all, that's actually read from 2 chapters. The first chapter is 1 paragraph long, and I'm assuming that was a really deliberate choice. Can you just talk a little bit about the decisions that went into beginning the book in this way?
It's funny because a lot of people have commented on it, and some people have described it as a little door, like you're opening a door to a house with that opening paragraph. It would begin with a moment in the house, and then things would sort of dilate out of that. And that seemed to be the shape that the chapters would take, starting in a more compressed and then kind of getting longer as we find out more and go back and in the past and find out the various reasons why she's done this dramatic thing. But the starting point was that she was going to make this rupture. And that seemed like the right style for that, to depict that rupture, a sort of staccato.
I want to stay with style for a moment because actually the book is shaped kind of like a door, and there are house keys on the cover. It's really this very beautifully and thematically appropriately designed book.
I know that people read on Kindles, and that's wonderful too, to have that. But the book object seems important because there's something in this book about touching the house and touching the parts of the house and feeling things directly on your body that seems really important in this book.
This may not be a moment that all our listeners or readers want to return to, but tell us a little bit about why you set the novel in 2017 in that early Trump administration moment.
It's one of those moments where you sort of say, why didn't I see this coming? And many people did see it coming. And you feel, as a character in the book, as Sam says, she was ignorant but not innocent. Because, of course, you see the fact that a month before the election, Trump had been accused of, on tape, saying horrible things about women. And he had many accusers and was nevertheless elected. It was a close election, but it shouldn't even have been close. It shocked many women I knew. We felt a deep vein of misogyny in that election. And many women voted for him anyway. And that was shocking. Maybe it meant that people were more concerned with hating immigrants than the fact that this president hated women. And so they could put up with that. Or it was this complicated, awful window into the state of America. And of course, it was all there all along to be seen. How could we have been so deluded? And I think one of the things that Sam in the book is really frightened of is self-delusion. She doesn't like that she doesn't see herself clearly. And of course, clarity about who you are is a very difficult thing to achieve. Everything is designed to take you away from that. And so I think she's kind of brave. She's flawed, she's a mess, but she's trying to be brave.
Was working on this book, writing this book, your way of working through what was happening politically, socially, culturally at that time?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about fiction is it's a way to kind of engage complexity without saying it is this or it's that. A lot of the culture is very pointed towards these stark black and white kind of superficial takes on things. Fiction is a good place where you can go to the contradictions and the paradoxes. And so I think, a woman like this who is both complicit and also feeling attacked at the same time by the cultural moment, you can kind of put her on the hook and make her do these reckless things and play out some of these things that you're feeling and observing in the culture in an interesting way. And I think that novels is a place where you can do this and where you should do this. It's not a place of answers. I think it's a place of questions.
That seems like a very nice place to end. As I said to you before we started recording, this is a book that so many people have been passing along and saying, like, this is the book you need to read right now. I think you've given a good sense of why.
Well, thank you. I think it's thrilling that it has word of mouth that people are saying that. That's great to hear. Thank you.
Dana Spiotta's new book is called Wayward. Tina Jordan joins us now to help us celebrate the 125th anniversary of the Book Review. Hi, Tina.
Hey, Pamela. So today I have an article from February the 5th, 1898 for you. And I thought it was timely because I know we've discussed on this segment before some of the shockingly negative reviews that the Book Review ran of books that went on to become quite popular. And it seems to me that this was a topic of conversation even back in 1898, because here is what the Book Review editor wrote in a little news story / op-ed. He said, "Those who take hacks at books sometimes gash them and blunder. When the Athenaeum's critic wrote about Alice in Wonderland when it was first printed, he made the following curious observations. This is a dream story, but who can manufacture a dream with all its loops and ties and loose threads and passages which lead to nothing?" He goes on to say, "We fancy that any real child might be more puzzled than enchanted by this stiff, overwrought story." And then the Book Review editor goes on to supply a little context. And he reminds the Times readers that a London publishing house very early on printed an edition of Lewis Carroll's Through a Looking Glass with the illustrations slightly askew on the page. And he requested that all purchasers of the faulty books return them to publishers so, quote, they might be exchanged for more perfect copies. But he also directed that the faulty books, he says, I propose instead of destroying them, I want to utilize them by giving them away to mechanics institutions, village reading rooms, and similar institutions where the means for purchasing such books are scanty. So there you have it.
Are you a Through the Looking Glass fan?
Can I say no?
Oh, no, you can't. Goodbye, Tina. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Pamela.
Ash Davidson joins us now from Flagstaff, Arizona, to talk about her new book, Damnation Spring. It's her first novel. Ash, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
And congratulations on the book. I will say that the book is reviewed on the cover of the Book Review this week. Give us a sense of what this novel is about.
So Damnation Spring is set in the Redwood Forest on the far northern coast of California, just shy of the Oregon line, near the mouth of the Klamath River. And this is a temperate rainforest. It's misty, there are vines, there are these chest-high ferns. And it's the story of a very tall logger named Rich Gunderson, who's obsessed with a very tall tree, the 24/7 tree. This is a tree wide enough to drive a car through, taller than the Statue of Liberty, and he mortgages everything he has to buy it and about 700 acres of trees around it. But he doesn't tell his wife. Meanwhile, Colleen, his wife, who's a homemaker, is also serving informally as a midwife in the community. And she has this encounter with an old flame who sort of plants the idea in her mind that some of the anomalies she's witnessed midwifing and perhaps even her own miscarriages might be related to herbicides the logging company is using. And this is deeply upsetting to her personally because she's been desperately trying to have a second child. And it's a suspicion that becomes pretty corrosive as the novel progresses, and it opens up a rift in her marriage. It threatens to ruin the couple financially, and it also exposes all these underlying fault lines in the town and also within their own family.
You're from this area, right?
I was born in Arcata, California, about an hour south of where the book is set in Klamath, but my family actually lived in Klamath the whole time that we lived in Northern California. Arcata was just the closest hospital. And my parents lived there about 8 years, and we left when I was 3.
And what brought them there?
My mother was on a road trip with a college friend and was driving down the coast of California and drove through Klamath. She's from New York, Rockland County, from Spring Valley, New York, and she just fell in love with the geography of Klamath and on a whim walked into a school and said, I want to work here. And they offered a job on the spot and she took it.
But the dominant industry in this area, presumably, is logging. Did anyone in your family have any experience in the logging industry?
No, my mother was a teacher. My dad was a carpenter. And so they didn't work directly in the logging industry. But as you say, almost everyone else in the community did or had someone in their family who did. And so they had friends and neighbors and parents of students in my mother's class. Almost everyone they came in contact to was somehow related to the wood products industry, whether it was logging or milling or cruising timber for the timber company. And so they had a lot of secondary knowledge and stories of the logging industry in the late 70s.
So this is the world in which you've set your book. Was there some spark from your childhood that got you interested in that business and in the woods that you remember as sitting there and I don't know, maybe becoming the colonel later on for inspiration?
Yes, there's that quote in Memory Wall by Anthony Doerr where he says, you bury your childhood here and there. It waits for you all your life to come back and dig it up. Well, for me, that was a series of stories that my parents told related to herbicide use, related to logging in the area. And so I set out to write a book about herbicides because I was curious. When we lived in Klamath, we relied on a creek behind the house for drinking water, similar to Rich and Colleen set up in the book. And my parents eventually became so concerned about contamination in that creek, which ran down gradient through logged land, that they stopped drinking from it. I was always curious about that decision and what those herbicides were. And my parents didn't have clear memories of it. They remembered that there were numbers in the names. And so it took a little bit of digging to find out that the herbicides in question were most likely 2,4,5-T and 2,4-D, which are the two active ingredients in Agent Orange. And so I set out to write that book about herbicide use. And then when I made research trips to Klamath as an adult, promptly realized that if I intended to set my book in this community and write about this issue, I was writing about people who worked in the woods because that's what virtually everyone did.
What is the life of a logger like, and how risky a business is logging?
I can only speak from having interviewed loggers and from reading, but it strikes me as one of the most dangerous and physically demanding technical jobs that you can imagine. In some of my research, I found that in the era where the book is set in the late 70s, logging was the third most dangerous job in the US, according to OSHA, I believe after commercial fishing and the military. And so it's very common if you've worked in this industry for a long time to have been injured, to know someone who has been killed. And even if you escape virtually unscathed, just with some cuts and bruises and a few scars, just the physical demands of the job take a toll on your body over time, especially when you consider that loggers are out in the woods often when they're being aerially sprayed. So they're also exposed to herbicides that way.
As someone who has never logged nor researched logging, I don't have a clear idea of what the dangers are. I mean, the obvious one is a tree falling on top of you, but I imagine there are other risks.
There are so many risks involved in logging that they're actually embedded in the terminology and language around logging. For example, a widowmaker is the word for a branch very high up in a tree that can break off and swoop down and fall. And if you're talking about a tree that's 350 feet high and a branch that's as wide around as your arm, that branch could kill you if it falls on your neck. And so in redwood logging, it was very important to be mindful of the wind and not be out logging when there were high winds. There are many women who were widowed by a branch falling on a man's neck.
As part of your research, you clearly spoke to a number of loggers. What did you learn from them about logging and their view of it that you wouldn't have known had you not talked to them?
So many things. I am deeply grateful to the loggers and mill workers in Klamath and Requa, California, who took the time to speak with me. When I first got to Klamath, it's a very small community. It's smaller now than it was in the era the book is set because the logging industry has contracted. And it was a little bit difficult to find men who would have logged in this time simply because it takes a toll on you physically and there weren't that many surviving. And it's a small insular community and I'm an outsider and I can understand the suspicion of speaking to some girl who shows up and says she wants to write a book. Will you talk to her? And so finally, out of desperation, my mom and I went to a community dinner and we walked into the community center and you could just hear the heads turn. And we walked through the line and we got our food. And then we had this really junior high moment where we stood there with our trays thinking like, oh no, where are we going to sit? And this woman just happened to recognize my mom because they'd taught together at Margaret Keating Elementary School 28 years before. And she escorted us over to her table and introduced her to a man sitting nearby who'd logged a lot of old growth. And he wouldn't talk to me inside. So we went out to the parking lot and leaned on the hood of his truck and he talked for 2 hours. And then the next time I interviewed him, he brought a photo album with him. And in it were all these photographs of his crew young cutting these giant trees. And it occurred to me that he had had the presence of mind to realize that they were falling trees that no human being alive today would ever see again. And his children wouldn't have the opportunity to fall trees like this the way he had and his father before him. And that really struck me. And finally, at the end, I got up the courage to ask him about the herbicides, which was the reason I was there. And I had gone into this with this idea that loggers were on one side and environmentalists were on the other, and that loggers somehow wouldn't care about the environmental impacts of their industry because it was key to their livelihood. And what surprised me is when I asked him about the sprays, he told me he'd been sprayed over while he was working and how it had affected him. You know, his eyes, his skin, his respiratory system, his breathing. And I was really forced to reassess this very tidy distinction that I'd formed in my mind because, of course, human beings are a lot more complicated.
How did he describe that feeling?
He said that it burned and you sort of choked on it a bit and it lasted for several days. And he used pretty colorful language to describe it, but the polite way of saying it was he was not pleased to be sprayed over while he was working. He said that they'd been strafed.
You talked about the divisions between tree huggers and loggers, between you as an outsider now coming into this community and the people who've lived there for a long time. But of course, the loggers themselves were intruders on the indigenous tribe of the Yuruks who have lived there for a lot longer. What is the central tension between the loggers and that indigenous community?
In the novel, it has to do largely with the health of the Klamath River because, and the book, I should emphasize that the book is fiction, so this is not None of what I'm about to say is documented in nonfiction, but the central tension is over the health of the Klamath River, which is the lifeblood of the Yurok tribe, and the health of the salmon population in that river. When herbicides are aerially sprayed, there's a big problem with drift. When you spray hundreds of gallons of toxic herbicides from the air, they don't always stay where you put them, especially if they come in contact with water, because this is an area where there's a lot of surface water. There are creeks and seeps and springs. And if that spray gets into that water, it migrates. And in a lot of these watersheds, they drain into the Klamath River, which is well known for its salmon runs. And the Yurok tribe's culture and identity is very strongly tied to those salmon populations. And in real life today, the Yurok tribe is the driving force in getting dams removed from the Klamath and negotiating with agricultural interests upriver to get more water in the Klamath and to make sure that water is cooler and healthier for the salmon population so we don't see another big fish kill like they saw in 2002.
You said earlier that you started off with an interest in herbicides and that you work for an environmental nonprofit. Did you know that you wanted to approach these issues through fiction?
I think so on some level. Even though I was 3 when I left Klamath, I grew up listening to my parents' stories of this place. And it is the most beautiful place they have ever lived. And that beauty is also the source of its own destruction. And so those stories became almost like a mythology of my childhood. And I think I always kept a folder of them in my head where I was filing them away. And I used a lot of them as scaffolding for the novel in the early years of writing it. And gradually, as time went on and the story got strong enough to stand on its own, I was able to strip away that scaffolding of their stories and let the fictional narrative shine through.
You mentioned earlier the book takes place in 1977. Why that particular time period?
There were some very practical reasons related to points in the plot that required the novel to be set in that time. For example, the expansion of Redwood National Park in 1978 is key to the plot, and the emergency suspension of one of the herbicides in the novel, 2,4,5-T, which happened in 1979. But I think even though it's a novel that's set 40 years ago, it could just as easily be written about coal mining in West Virginia or fracking in Pennsylvania or the uranium industry in the Southwest today, because it's a book about one issue in one small town, but it could be written about a dozen different issues in 100 small towns across this country, because it's really a novel about greed and about love and about the relationship between humans and the natural world. And it tries really hard not to take sides. It asks the reader to recognize the shared humanity of people who might not vote the way you do. Because I think no matter what side you're on, whether it's 1977 or 2021, those basic human desires, to take care of the people we love, to keep them safe the best way we know how, those are shared.
A lot of fiction that addresses the environment or the climate these days tends to be dystopic or post-apocalyptic. That's obviously not your approach here. How did you think about setting and tone and genre, this kind of recent historical fiction, as a way to convey the story about environmental degradation?
Writing is a very sedentary and largely indoor activity. And I wrote at 5 a.m. before work every day. And so it was often dark, especially in the winter. And I think choosing to write about this beautiful place that I love outside was my way of transporting myself and being outside. And I think that's something I really look for in books as a reader. So it was a happy accident for me to be able to replicate that in my writing process. I think that as dystopian as clear-cutting of ancient redwood forests seems. When I returned to Klamath with my mom and looked for the site of our old cabin, which was torn down in the mid-1980s, we returned to the spot on the bluff overlooking False Klamath Cove where it sat, and I thought for sure we would find pieces of foundation or pipes. But when we actually went in hunting, there was not a trace left of that house. And the area where the house had been completely retaken by the forest. And it's not an old growth forest. It's a very different forest than the original forest. But I was really struck by the ability of the natural world to recover and repair and live without us.
Are you up again at 5 a.m. in the morning working on another novel?
I am.
All right. Well, for now, listeners can pick up this book. I want to read one line from the review. This is the cover review this week. And here's what our reviewer had to say. It's a glorious book, an assured novel that's gorgeously told. You really can't get much better than that for your debut. So, Ash, congratulations on the book. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Ash Davidson's debut novel is called Damnation Spring. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, Pamela. So there was a big announcement this week that was somewhat surprising. A lot of people reacted on social media with enthusiastic befuddlement. Dolly Parton, the country star, is publishing a novel, her first. And she has found a pretty experienced co-author. It's James Patterson, who is one of the best-selling thriller writers of all time. He's sold hundreds of millions of copies. I think it's something like 425 million copies globally. And one of the secrets to his success, or it's not a secret because he's pretty explicit about it, is he teams up with co-authors. He has worked with dozens of writers to publish at this frenetic pace. And he has recently found some pretty famous people to team up with, including President Bill Clinton. They wrote 2 thrillers together that were huge hits. But it was pretty surprising to see him reach out to a country singer. And so when the news broke this week, I emailed to see if I could talk to James Patterson about how this strange partnership came together. And he said he'd been a fan of Parton's and reached out to her, went down to Nashville. This was in February of 2020, right before the pandemic. They had a meeting. He said there were no agents, no lawyers. He was very funny about that, to say that it was like a casual meeting of friends. And he had this outline for a novel about an aspiring country singer, and Dolly Parton loved it and said she would love to work on it. And he told me that 2 days later, she had written a lot of notes on the plot and 6 or I think 7 songs that the main character in the novel writes and sings. So this is going to be kind of an unusual project. It's coming out in 2022 in the spring from Little Brown. That's James Patterson's normal publisher. And they're going to release an album at the same time, or rather Dolly Parton is. I don't think James Patterson is going to be singing country on this album. But the album has 12 songs. It is also called Run, Rose, Run, which is the title of the novel. And according to the press release, Parton said that all the songs are based on the characters and situations in the book. So it'll be interesting to see, since Patterson's had success with Bill Clinton. This is obviously a very different kind of celebrity. Dolly Parton is incredibly popular. She's, I think, unique in pop culture in that she seems to be beloved across the political and geographic and class spectrum, seems to be completely immune to any kind of controversy. She's got a lot of credit for donating money to the development of the Moderna vaccine. She has this childhood literacy nonprofit that's donated more than 150 million books. So she's, this icon. And so it'll be interesting to see if Patterson could pick up some readers from her fan base. It's not like he usually needs a lot of help. He's pretty well established at this point, but Little Brown is clearly excited by the commercial prospects. They said in their press release that this novel will mark the first time that a #1 best-selling author and an entertainment icon who has sold over 100 million albums worldwide have collaborated on a book and an album. So I think they are anticipating a hit. It'll be interesting to see how people respond.
Well, they're both huge advocates of literacy and the publishing world and books. So
That's right. Yeah, they have that in common. I mean, James Patterson has done an incredible amount of work supporting independent bookstores, libraries, and literacy. You know, he gives away a lot of books, but he also just has these grants where struggling bookstores can apply and just get money from James Patterson to stay in business. So I think he has been an incredible advocate on those fronts as well. One thing that's kind of funny is this is not the first crossover musician and big name author book to have been announced recently. As I'm sure you remember, a few weeks ago, Barack Obama and Bruce Springsteen announced that they were collaborating on a book, which is really just an extension of their podcast. It's interviews and photos and other kind of archival material. But I was thinking, wow, who's going to be next?
are you secretly teaming up with James Patterson or, I don't know, J-Lo or what have you got in the works, Alexandra?
I mean, I'm trying to think of who would be my dream crossover musician. Well, actually, Josh Ritter, who is a musician, has a novel coming out. And there's a lot of musicians who write novels. I think Ishiguro used to be a songwriter. That was his original aspiration. So there is a lot of overlap.
All right. I'm waiting for your big announcement, Alexandra.
Stay tuned for
Okay.
a long time.
Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
My colleagues John Williams and Liz Egan join us now to talk about what we're reading. Hey, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
Hey, Pamela.
John, it's been a while. What are you reading?
It has been a while. I'm reading a biography of Emerson by Robert Richardson. That's Ralph Waldo Emerson, not Keith Emerson of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Richardson died a little more than a year ago. He was 86 years old. He was a very acclaimed biographer of Emerson, Thoreau, and William James. And that's the only book of his previously that I've read, a really, really great biography of James.
Why am I not surprised, John?
Well, you know, the bar is high for me because I love him so much. But the way he tells the life is just brilliant. It's probably my favorite biography. There's a lot to say about Emerson, so I'll keep this brief. It's a sprawling book in some ways, but it's also told in these relatively short chapters for a biography, which makes it much easier to read, which is nice, and to find stopping points and come back to it. But very early on, he does something similar that he does in the James bio, and I really love this because I don't read a ton of biographies, and one of the things that slows me down is that as much as I'm interested in genealogy, and I stop dead when someone starts with, you know, in 1812, the great-great-great-grandfather of the person you want to read about was born on a farm, and then they spend 5 days talking about him. I just want to get a little bit more into the life more quickly. And what Richardson did so brilliantly is he just puts you in media res into these lives. And in the James book, it starts with him essentially waking up at 64 years old during the great earthquake of 1906 in California. And so he just starts with this scene. You're right there in the moment with him, and he's very much alive. And with Emerson, he does something similar, a little creepier, as you'll see. But I'm just going to read the first paragraph. On March 29th, 1832, the 28-year-old Emerson visited the tomb of his young wife, Ellen, who had been buried a year and 2 months earlier. He was in the habit of walking from Boston out to her grave in Roxbury every day. But on this particular day, he did more than commune with the spirit of the departed Ellen. He opened the coffin. Ellen had been young and pretty. She was 17 when they were engaged, 18 when married, and barely 20 when she died of advanced tuberculosis. They had made frantic efforts at a cure, including long open-air carriage rides and massive doses of country air. Their life together had been stained almost from the start by the bright blood of Ellen's coughing.
That's a brilliant opening.
Right? I mean, so there's this way that he really and obviously grabs you with his openings and shows you these people, in this case, next to a dead person, but the subject that he's writing about very much alive and in the moment. And then he kind of goes on to say, interestingly, that it wasn't incredibly rare for this to happen back in those days, opening the coffin, that he says it's not a grisly Gothic gesture or the wild aberration of an unhinged lover, that he had actually had good friends who had done the same things.
It's what everyone did.
It's what everyone did. I mean, he says that Edgar Allan Poe did it, although I'm not sure. Oh no, actually, Edgar Allan Poe's literary executor. Okay. Well, that's different because I was going to say Poe wouldn't necessarily be a case for the normalcy of it. So that's what I'm sort of in the midst of. It's a big fat biography, and I'm nearing about the halfway point, and it's terrific.
When did this book come out?
This book was published in 1995. I should say he was married to Annie Dillard, Another
Are you
very,
serious?
very bright literary light. Yes, our obituary is funny because it says, Henry David Thoreau, A Life of the Mind, 1986, did not win any major literary awards, but it prompted a fan letter from Annie Dillard, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. They ended up marrying in 1988, Miss Dillard later recalled, after, quote, 2 lunches and 3 handshakes.
That's amazing.
Wow,
Actually,
I love that.
I want to see a book described as the loser of several major literary prizes. Just casually in the description, the author bio.
Not only did not win any major literary awards, but it was shunned by most.
Shot down, virtually ignored by most literary award committees.
What are the prize status of what you're reading, Liz?
I am here to tell you guys about a book that I'm reading that I think you might have both read. It's called Transcendent Kingdom, and it's by Yaa Gyasi, who wrote Homegoing, which came out, her debut novel that came out, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. This is a very different book from Homegoing. It is a story of a Stanford graduate student named Gifty, whose family has emigrated from Ghana to Alabama. And when we meet Gifty, she is in, I think, her 6th year of her PhD program, studying reward-seeking behavior in mice, and also caring for her mother, who is extremely depressed. And as the book unfolds, we learn that Gifty's father disappeared back to Ghana when she was a kid, and that her brother, who was a really promising athlete, died of a heroin overdose after becoming addicted to OxyContin, which was prescribed to him for an ankle injury. I'm loving the book for the story and the writing, but also because I just finished reading Empire of Pain, Patrick Radden Keefe's book about the Sackler family and its connection to Oxy. And so to read a novel with this theme of addiction in it just feels kind of like the perfect complement. And I wanted to read a very short paragraph that I thought was quite beautiful. I had never been to therapy myself. This is from Gifty's perspective. And when the time came for me to choose what to study, I didn't choose psychology. I chose molecular biology. I think when people heard about my brother, they assumed that I had gone into neuroscience out of a sense of duty to him. But the truth is, I'd started this work not because I wanted to help people, but because it seemed like the hardest thing you could do. And I wanted to do the hardest thing. I wanted to flay any mental weakness off my body like fascia from muscle. Throughout high school, I never touched a drop of alcohol because I lived in fear that addiction was like a man in a dark trench coat stalking me, waiting for me to get off the well-lit sidewalk and step into an alley. I had seen the alley. I had watched Nana walk into the alley, and I had watched my mother go in after him. And I was so angry at them for not being strong enough to stay in the light. And so I did the hard thing.
She's so good.
I know. Her writing is exquisite. And this book is so different from Homegoing. I mean, I loved Homegoing, but I think what I'm loving about this is it is just a complete departure. And normally when we pick up a sophomore book, I kind of brace myself for disappointment. But in this case, I just feel like I'm in a whole different school for sophomore year in the best way.
I haven't read her, but you're tempting me.
Oh, John, you should. You would really like her.
Pamela, what are you reading these days?
I just read another novel by Lionel Shriver, and listeners will remember I talked about a book of hers, So Much for That, a few months ago on the podcast, and said then that I hadn't read her before, which is true. I'd never read her before. I always felt like it was one of those holes. I have a lot of friends who are fans, and So Much for That I kind of picked up because that's what I had. But the book that I was told to read by several people who I think are real authorities, including one of the publishers of the Big Five, told me the book to read of Lionel Shriver's is The Post-Birthday World. And Liz, I'm happy that you are on this particular segment because you were there when another person said you have to read this book. Our mutual friend, Jenny Rosenstrack, who often reviews for the book review and writes cookbooks on her own, recommended this novel. And when I posted about this book on Instagram, so many people came out of the woodwork and had that book response in the comments. And it's no surprise because the book has one of those, to my mind, perennially intriguing setups, which is it's a counterfactual. It's like Kate Atkinson's Life After Life, or like the movie Sliding Doors. What would have happened if just one teeny little thing had been different, and that would have set a life on a completely different course? And in an interview in the back of the book, Lionel Shriver says that she very deliberately didn't want to have one be the happy ending, and the perfect thing, and the other not, that life is more complicated than that. And I think what Lionel Shriver is really good at is complexity. So in this novel, the main character, whose name is Irina, is a children's book illustrator living in London with her partner, Lawrence, who is this very sort of set in his ways guy who works at a big foreign policy think tank working on complicated international issues of conflict, like the Troubles in Ireland. And they have this really steady, nice relationship. Nothing is wrong with it. And they have a couple friend who splits up. And while that couple friend is together, they started having this ritual of going out for a birthday dinner for the husband in that pair, Ramsey's birthday. And when the couple splits up, they just go out with Ramsey. And one year, Lawrence is out of town on business, and Irina is left to go out with Ramsey on his birthday alone. And Ramsey Acton is this very famous, but not entirely successful snooker player. I think it's snooker, and I think Americans say snooker, but I'm going to stick with the more comfortable American pronunciation here. So he is a snooker player, and in both scenarios, he sort of makes a pass at her after they kind of have a debauched night out in the basement of his home where there's like a big snooker table, naturally. And in one case, she kisses him and accepts the kiss, and the story goes in one direction. And in the other, she rebuffs him and stays with Lawrence. And it's kind of what plays out if she, depending on whether she kissed him back or not. It goes in really surprising directions. Again, Lionel Shriver does not like to do things easily. But one of the things I enjoy about her work is she's an incredibly astute observer of human behavior and emotion. People tend to describe Lionel Shriver as a kind of dark and foreboding, icy figure. I think that's because she's most keenly attuned to the worst in human behavior, the worst side of everyone. It's like she's the opposite of having a charitable interpretation of how another person thinks or behaves. And so I too will read just one very short passage here. This is a scene in which Irina is at home visiting her mother, Raisa, who is a Russian immigrant in America in Brighton Beach. When the other two returned, Ramsey ran his hands over her shoulders and kissed the hollow behind her earlobe. Her mother's eyes sharpened. Raisa didn't approve of groping in public, no matter how obvious it appeared to Irina that behind that stern glance of reproach lay jealousy. Raisa herself would never recognize her sense of decorum as the bitter fruit of sexual neglect. In fact, because the unself-aware, which includes basically everybody, are impervious to uncharitable perceptions of their underlying motives, all these insights you have into people and what makes them tick are surprisingly useless. Censure registered, Raisa excused herself coolly to the kitchen. So it's just like in that one tiny passage of a mother really not taking kindly to this public display of affection between her daughter and her daughter's boyfriend. You have this insight, not just into this specific character, but kind of into people very generally at their worst. One of the things people say about her is that each book is very different. I will say that the downside is they're very long. They're a little too long. Like the editor in me kind of wants to go in with a carving knife and slice out some sections, just tighten things up. And they are, a kind of dark side of humanity. So you sort of really have to be in the mood for that.
You're always in the mood for that. You're usually in the mood.
I was going to say.
I know.
We know that about you, Pamela.
No, but she's like the Joe Nesbo of, of sort of psychological fiction. I like a dark thriller. I like a serial killer running around and a hapless detective or a compromised detective loping after him. That said, Joe Nesbo takes it to the extreme, and I feel like Lionel Shriver takes it to the extreme in a very different kind of novel. So you really do have to be in the mood.
Yeah, it's a little too much like real life. Nesbo's a little more fantastical in terms of the plots.
Yeah. They're both basically, in a weird way, they're like real life on a really bad day. So you gotta want to take that.
That's a good title for something.
I love that. But don't we have enough bad days happening right now? Normally, I'm a huge reader of Lionel's, but I'm looking, I guess Transcendent Kingdom is hardly light reading.
What have you read of hers?
I have read The Post-Birthday World, which I loved. I read We Need to Talk About Kevin. I read Double Fault, the one about tennis, which I
I'm not
love.
going to read a book about tennis.
And I hate tennis. But
Okay, maybe I will.
I also think if you're into the thing, she tends to pick an issue or a particular subject area for each book. I mean, I know every author does, but in Lionel Shriver's case, it feels particularly pronounced. And if you happen to be into the subject, whether it's health insurance or euthanasia, you can get on board. But if you're not into it, you might not be into that particular book.
What strikes me from this conversation, and not something I would have thought otherwise, is that there's a real dearth of snooker players in contemporary fiction.
That's right.
Yes.
Someone should get on that. John?
I'm going to go learn more about what snooker is, and then I'm going to write the book. It's going to take a while to research.
I can't wait to read it.
All right, John. Liz, let's run down the titles again of what you all read.
I'm reading Emerson, The Mind on Fire by Robert D. Richardson.
I'm reading Transcendent Kingdom by Yaa Gyasi.
And I read The Post-Birthday World by Lionel Shriver. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstubber Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.